Okay, David, welcome back to the archive again. This is like what, the fifth, the eighth time we're
Yeah,
doing it?
it's at least the third or fourth.
Third or fourth,
Yeah,
yeah.
I forget exactly how
Um,
many it's been.
Today we're going to talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yeah, yeah, I'm a big fan of Hawthorne.
Okay, so Nathaniel Hawthorne, his name in American literature, um, and you guys happen to have his house. Rumor is that eventually you're going to start up the Nathaniel Hawthorne Museum.
Yeah, so that's in the works right now. We've got the design sort of nailed down, and we're doing some fundraising. But we're hoping the Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace is sort of a natural place to have a Hawthorne museum. And so we're hoping to create something that really encapsulates his life from his earliest days and his family and his sort of relationship to Salem through some of his relation to the politics of his time, the fellow authors who inspired him and he had friendships with, his own family, like his wife and children, and then his work and his legacy and how that all shapes how he's perceived today, and really trying to create more of an awareness of Hawthorne. We felt like, unlike Edgar Allan Poe or Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson, these are people that a lot of Americans, if they've done some reading, if they're pretty literary, they have a kind of picture that pops in their head of Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe and kind of what the feeling of their writing is, or a little bit about sort of where they're from. Hawthorne, a lot of people read the Scarlet Letter or short stories like Young Goodman Brown in school, but there's not as much of a sort of almost like brand of Hawthorne, for lack of a better word, like a sort of association that pops up. 100 years ago, people all over the country would have had a really readily available sense of who Hawthorne was, what his writing was, and so we want to recapture that a little bit and sort of bring him back into the forefront of American literature. Whereas, we found over the last, I've worked here over a decade, and like a lot of people, a lot of Americans don't know who Hawthorne is. They've never read any of his works, and so, you know, keeping him in the conversation.
Okay, so what made him so relevant during his time, and what makes him, in terms of American history, what allowed him in his writings to leave a stamp in the history books?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say what allowed him to do that, first of all, was just his enormous talent. He was a very skilled writer when it comes to word choice, sentence forming, his themes and settings, the sort of ways that he captures characters and the sense of place. And so, first of all, he wouldn't be Nathaniel Hawthorne if he wasn't a really good writer. And so that's the sort of first step along the way. And then his timing was really great in terms of he's born in 1804. He's born here in Salem, which at that point is one of the most important cities in the country, really thriving commercial port. His family is involved in that business, although his father dies when Hawthorne's quite young. And he comes of age in this generation that his grandfather was in the Revolution. He's part of this America, early America in the 1800s, that's starting to get a sense of itself. He's just a child during the War of 1812, but he really comes of age during the James Monroe presidency, the era of good feelings, as it's called. And then you have Jacksonian democracy following that. And so this is the time period that he's really coming of age in and getting to know America, trying to form an idea of what America is and what it means to be an American. And then he dies during the Civil War. And so his career really spans this period of the 1820s to the 1860s that's so vital for the creation of a sense of America and American literature. And so he's a very talented writer. He's got great sort of influences. He reads a lot of the classics. He knows his stuff. He's read the great books. He's here at the right time. And he's got sort of the right fascinations to make him somebody that that was very popular at the time, that he was interested in witchcraft. He was interested in early American architecture, and one of the first people to sort of find that interesting in the country. He's interested in questions of sin. He's interested in questions of the artist and society, about like the patriarchy and the system of the world.
So he has a very interesting fascination in sociology and sociological structures as well as the individual.
Yeah, definitely. Like Hawthorne is very much a writer thinking always about society and about the nation, the town or city, the family in some instances, the world, what it means to be a person in society and what society means for people. That's something that he's always thinking about in his writing, and it really comes through as a theme in a lot of his works.
Okay, so I remember Nathaniel Hawthorne, particularly in high school. I didn't like him because it was so dark and morbid.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I was reading some like 18th century goth boy writings.
Yeah.
Although they were like really well written and they were really well thought out, it was pretty dark.
Yeah, there's no denying that Hawthorne's worldview is pretty cynical. He has flashes of hope, and it's something that people don't associate with him as much. Is some of his writing is actually quite florid and beautiful, celebrating some of the joys of life and the nice things of society and things like that. That's definitely not what he's most known for. And the overall feeling of his writing is this sense of cynicism, of irony, of morbidity, the feeling of death and sin overriding so much of the world. And he gets that from a lot of his predecessors, kind of the period right before Hawthorne is born, and in his early years, that's really the major popular mode of fiction in the English-speaking world, is the Gothic. That starting in the 1760s, with some sort of early beginnings and really picking up steam in the 1790s, the Gothic novel and Gothic short stories are something that people are reading in England and America, and it really shapes a lot of people's sensibilities. And this sense of one of the sort of hallmarks of the Gothic that Hawthorne uses so well in a New England setting is this feeling of a past that we're now existing in the ruins of the length of time that passes between generations and people living through, like families passing down through time. And Hawthorne uses that to great effect in novels like The House of the Seven Gables. But that's what he would have been reading as a kid. We know that he read Anne Radcliffe, who is a very popular writer in the 1790s for novels like The Mystery of Udolpho and The Italian. And these are novels set in ruined castles in Italy with murders and mystery and intrigue. And Jane Austen parodies it in Northanger Abbey. So this is something that, to his day, that kind of morbid, dark feeling, which you also see in Edgar Allan Poe, is really like the literary mode that he grows up in.
Mm-hmm. So there's already the stage being set for him to start exploring these darker.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, at the time of which he starts to become published, is he huge? Like he becomes a national hit?
It's a little bit of a mix. So his very first book barely makes a splash. It's written in 1825, right after he graduates from college, and it's called Fanshawe. And unlike, it's not quite as dark and gothic and brooding as some of his other works, except for its sort of ending definitely has that feeling. But it's more in the line of another very popular mode of writing at the time, which is sort of historical fiction, the fantasy of Sir Walter Scott, like the Waverley novels that were very popular in both Europe and America at the time, like Ivanhoe. And so he writes this book called Fanshawe about a student who falls in love with a girl, and then she's kidnapped by her long lost, someone claiming to be her long lost father, and it's a sort of adventure story. But he published it anonymously. It got some reviews that some were favorable, but Hawthorne got quite embarrassed by it, and for the rest of his life never claimed ownership of it. His publisher asked him about it years later, and he denied having written it. So there was sort of a soft entrance into the world. And then for the next 12 years, he never signed his name to his work until 1837. So for 12 years, he wrote some of his most iconic short stories, like The Minister's Black Veil and some of his other really great early writing, under just anonymous names. Sometimes in the late 1830s, he got to be known as like the author of The Gentle Boy, which was a story about a Quaker boy in New England in the 1600s, and sort of about religious fanaticism on both the Quaker and Puritan side of things. And it's a very tragic story. And so sometimes it appears in these gift annuals, which would be these books that people would pull together, like these publishers would pull together stories and poems, mostly by anonymous authors, to be printed and then given as a gift around Christmas time or as a birthday gift to people. And Hawthorne appears in a lot of those, and in some magazines and newspapers, either anonymously or with the name of another story, like by the author of The Gentle Boy. And a friend from college convinces him to publish under his own name, and then he sort of suitably decides to call it Twice Told Tales, because they've already been published. And so when Twice Told Tales comes out by Nathaniel Hawthorne, he becomes a literary figure that's known to literate people. He is not a household name in the 1830s and 40s, I'm sure, but if you're the type of person that's reading literary journals, that's reading new books, new fiction, you would know Nathaniel Hawthorne. I found an article from, I think it was a Boston newspaper in 1837, right after Twice Told Tales was published, where they talk about how he's joined this group of Nathaniels. There's Nathaniel Parker Willis, who was a pretty famous writer in his day who's now forgotten. And they say that, this author of the Twice Told Tales will soon probably become the most famous Nathaniel. And they were right. And then with the Scarlet Letter in 1850, and then the House of the Seven Gables and a wonder book for girls and boys, which is a book of kids' stories based on Greek myths. Those three together in the early 1850s really make a name for Hawthorne, and he becomes known internationally. People know his reputation when he goes to England in 1853. The actress Fanny Kemble said that the House of the Seven Gables caused a sensation unknown in England since Jane Eyre, which had come out about a few years before. And so he is well known in England, and his book is translated into a lot of European languages in the early 1850s. Whether your average sort of literate person in France or Germany or Italy or Spain knew who Hawthorne was, I'm not quite sure at that period. And then it's really in the early 1860s that he becomes a superstar and gets known as like the American writer. He dies quite young at 59, and then the next generation who follows really idolize Hawthorne. William Dean Howells, who is a really important literary critic and novelist in the late 1800s, met Hawthorne as a young man when Hawthorne was still alive, and they talked about literature. And Howells' friend Henry James, who really is considered one of the greatest American novelists today, and the two of them really helped shape a lot of literary taste in America. They see Hawthorne as the realist of the Romantics, of this era, of like the Poe era. Hawthorne is seen by the literary tastemakers in the late early 1900s as the most accomplished and literary author. And so he's hoisted up while people like Poe, James Fenimore Cooper, who in Hawthorne's day was probably the most famous American writer, they sort of fall by the wayside a little bit in the canon, and people that we now revere, like Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, they don't really find their footing in the canon until like the 1920s.
Oh, that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
That is interesting. I didn't know that beforehand. He also wrote an international selling children's book.
Yeah. And it's interesting that I think that a lot of our understanding as Americans of the Greek myths, kind of like the classic stories we get of like King Midas or the Pandora's box, those are, I think, filtered through Hawthorne's version of them, or Perseus and the Medusa. That is Hawthorne like creating these stories for children that were wildly popular, and they went through a lot of editions in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and almost all of them were illustrated by really great illustrators like Maxfield Parrish, and there are these some of the best children's illustrations come from these Hawthorne like short stories for children.
So that's pretty remarkable that
Yeah.
he really has had that kind of influence.
Yeah.
I can even see how, like in the mid to late 1900s, suddenly where there was a burst on the silver screen, even of Greek classics
Yeah.
and Greek-inspired myths. Definitely, he had an influence on that somehow.
I'd like to think so, yeah. And of course, like in college in the 1820s, when he's going to college, reading Greek and Latin is most of the curriculum,
Yeah.
like reading the classics. And so that's something that he's one of a lot of American writers in that period who are grappling with the legacy of the classics and Greek and Roman stuff, but definitely a lot of those myths he really helps to popularize in America.
Yeah, so let's talk quickly about him as a person.
Yeah. He, I think, would have been a difficult person to know. I don't think he would have been a great friend. He has some lifelong friends who really admire him and care for him, but he's a very sort of shy, inward, introverted guy, kind of prickly, very ironic, and he is very interested in literature. He's very interested in history. He loves to eat and smoke. He loves nature, and he travels a bit as a young man, and then again near the end of his life in Europe, and is always sort of training his eye on what he's seeing and really perceptively thinking about the history and society of wherever he is, whether it's England or Italy or France in the late 1800s. And he's sort of this like brooding, quiet, observant guy who can be a little testy and difficult. You know, he comes across as kind of a little... trying to find a nice way to say that he's a difficult person. The anecdote that always pops in my mind is, as a young man, he had gone to live for a few months in a transcendentalist commune called Brook Farm to find a cheap place to live when he got married. And after he left, he invested in some shares for the commune as a way of making some money. The commune burnt down, and almost immediately, I think like 2 days later, he was demanding the return of his money. He didn't really care that the buildings had burned and that they were, financially ruined. He's like, "Where's my money?" And so,
Where's my money, damn it?
exactly. Like he's a little bit prickly that way, I think. And he would have been I think kind of an awkward guy to know. Emerson, when he's talking about his friend Thomas Carlyle, a great English historian and writer, he said Carlyle was like Hawthorne if he was less awkward. That's literally what he said. But yeah.
That is interesting. And you guys are also not that far from where he worked at the customs house.
Yeah. And so in the late 1840s, Hawthorne had a day job working in the custom house. I say day job, sort of took up most of his time, and it's only when he's fired that he really sets down to writing the Scarlet Letter, and that happens in 1849. But I'm sure in that time he is turning around in his head some of these ideas that become the Scarlet Letter. He even opens that novel with a long chapter talking about the custom house. But yeah, for a few years at the end of the 1840s, he is an inspector at the custom house. So he is looking at all these goods coming into Salem. But the catch is that by that point, Salem is not the great maritime hub it had been. And so it's kind of quiet, a little sleepy. He talks about people sitting on the steps of the custom house looking for jobs, that the wharf in front of it is kind of empty of ships compared to its heyday when he was a kid. And so that is something that really shapes his sense of Salem. It's not a city that he really liked. He tried to get away a few times. He kept coming back, but it, this sort of great maritime hub that's faded into becoming almost sort of a backwater in a way it feels to him in the 1850s, late 1840s. And so that really influences the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah, pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and that's just down the street from us. It's owned by the National Park Service. It's actually the very first National Historic Site in the United States in 1938 was the Salem Maritime National Historic Site.
Really?
Yeah.
But that bit of history, not that far from here, too.
No, not far from here at all.
You can go visit his house, and then afterwards you can go visit the place where he worked.
Yeah, and there are 4 other houses in Salem that Hawthorne lived in because he tended to live in Salem for sort of short bursts and then move elsewhere and come back. He lived in a few different places, but the other 4 are all private houses. And so the only one that's open to the public in Salem is the Hawthorne birthplace on our campus at the House of the Seven Gables. And then there's the house he spent most of his childhood in on Herbert Street, just sort of around the corner from the park site, just down the road from here. He spent some time after college in a house on Dearborn Street in North Salem. He spent a very short period in a house that's now on Chestnut Street. And then in the late 1840s, early 1850s, he was living in a place on Mall Street off the Common, which is where he wrote the Scarlet Letter. And there's a plaque on the side of that house saying that's the house where he wrote the Scarlet Letter. And there was a lot of interest in the late 1800s in both the Scarlet Letter house at 14 Mall Street and the Hawthorne birthplace on Union Street. And of course, the birthplace ended up here. The Mall Street house is still like a private house.
Remarkable.
Yeah. And then if you go to Concord, just to advertise some of our friends, you can see the Old Manse, which is a beautiful house owned by the trustees of the reservations. That's where Hawthorne and his wife lived after they were married for 3 years at the beginning of the 1840s. And that is where he was inspired to write Mosses from an Old Manse, which is his second collection of short stories. And there's the Wayside House, which the National Park Service owns in Concord, which is the house that Hawthorne owned at the end of his life and where he did some of his writing as well. And there's his boyhood home in Maine, but that's not open to the public typically. So there's a few other Hawthorne places out there. And the house he lived in Boston for a few years, I haven't quite figured out. I think it's still standing, but it's just a private house, and nobody really talks about that one much.
It's a secret. It's one of Boston's secret.
Exactly. Yeah, it's over by Beacon Hill, sort of off, I think it's Washington Street. I always forget the name of it. I was just sort of looking into it recently. But he was living there in the 1830s for a period, working at the Boston Custom House.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So two of America's most historical cities. He was also working in Custom House for.
Yeah, and Hawthorne, like Edgar Allan Poe and a lot of the other writers in that period, were sort of itinerant in a way that both Poe and Hawthorne, Poe over a much wider expanse of the American eastern seaboard, and Hawthorne pretty much in New England, lived in a lot of different places over the course of their lives.
Yeah. So David, is there anything else you feel like to cover about Hawthorne?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about Hawthorne. There's a lot of books about him. People have not run out of things to say about him yet. He left a relatively small shelf of published works, smaller than some of his contemporaries, but, compared to Charles Dickens, who was pretty near contemporary to Hawthorne. They both lived to be 59. Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. Hawthorne, 1804 to 1864. It's pretty similar. Charles Dickens, his books are pretty thick and they fill a lot of space on a shelf. Hawthorne, he only wrote 5 novels, most of which are some of the shortest sort of great novels in American history and literature. He wrote some nonfiction. After his death, a lot of his notebooks were published by his wife in a sort of censored, redacted form. And then a lot of his unpublished manuscripts, a few of them for like unfinished books, were completed by his son Julian. His son Julian and his daughter Rose both write biographies of his parents. And then by the late 1800s, Rose's husband George Parsons Lathrop writes a biography of Hawthorne and helps put together an edition of his books for Houghton Mifflin. And then it hasn't stopped ever since, that people have been writing biography after biography. The most recent sort of major one was Brenda Wineapple's in 2004. And before that, there's a really fantastic one that's, I think, not as well known today, but James Mello wrote a book called Hawthorne in His Times in about 1980, which is a doorstop of a book, but it really gets into it. And so one of the things that a lot of those people focus on, especially Mello and Wineapple, are the politics of it. I was talking earlier that he's grown up in this era of good feelings, Jacksonian democracy. That has a big impact on Hawthorne's early life. Some of his early stories are published in a Democratic Party newspaper. And so he is more Southern sympathizing. His good friend from college, Franklin Pierce, becomes, in the estimates of people today, one of the worst presidents in American history, sort of bottom 5. The president just before James Buchanan, just before the Civil War, that really kind of deepens the crisis with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and really brings us to the Civil War. And so Hawthorne's politics, from today's standpoint, are a little off-putting. He's somebody that he's very cynical and doesn't really want big change, so he's willing to make peace with the existence of slavery as an institution because he doesn't think there should be big-scale change in his day. So when the Civil War does come about, he's very critical of it. He's very critical of President Lincoln. And so that's an aspect that, as we're putting this Hawthorne Museum together, we're looking at, how do you square this person who writes these really amazing works that talk about the corruption of society and the struggle of the individual, like in The Scarlet Letter or Young Goodman Brown, who supports the status quo in his day of an institution like slavery. And especially when a lot of his friends are really radical abolitionists, like his sisters-in-law, Mary and Elizabeth Peabody. And so that's a really interesting aspect of Hawthorne's life that a lot of his biographers have struggled with is, how do you take somebody that in his own personal writings is pretty misogynistic, but then in The Scarlet Letter creates Hester Prynne, who's one of these great icons of feminism in American literature. And so it's a tough nut to crack in a way.
Yeah, that's definitely enough to keep your hands full for a while.
Yeah, and that's probably why they're never going to stop writing biographies of Hawthorne.
Yeah, I mean, it makes him a very complex character, especially with a modern set of eyes.
Yeah.
To sit down and try and go through a fine-tooth and comb and make sense of.
Yeah, and the last sort of thing I'll say about Hawthorne, too, is that there's this enigma about him that Herman Melville, who was a good friend of his, caught on to and talked about in a piece of criticism called Hawthorne and His Mosses, that later critics have really latched into, which is what is the sin the shame at the heart of Hawthorne's life. Because it seems that there is this really deep inward guilt and shame that he feels and expresses over and over again in his writing, whether it's The Minister's Black Veil or The House of the Seven Gables or The Scarlet Letter. And so a lot of critics have sort of tried to dig and find a smoking gun, like it's this childhood trauma or this sense of guilt over the witch trials connections of his ancestors that made Hawthorne who he was. But I think it's an answer that's probably never going to be found. But that's another thing that drives people to continually look through Hawthorne's life, is trying to find what happened or what, sense of himself created his sort of gloomy, brooding obsession with sin that permeates so much of his work.
Yeah, that is definitely a fascinating thing that I think everybody will always be talking about.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so he is raised in a kind of mixed background, Unitarian and Congregationalist, which are not too different from each other, but in that period, the New England churches were kind of splitting from the early 1700s Puritan origins of the New England church to the more conservative Congregationalists and the more liberal Unitarians, to sort of simplify everything. And one of his aunts, Priscilla Dyke, who is a big figure in his early life, and especially his sister Maria's life, is a very staunch sort of Calvinist Congregationalist. And his friend Herman Melville in Hawthorne and His Mosses identifies Hawthorne as, the last Puritan, is how he sees him, this person who's very obsessed with sin and that whole sort of Puritan worldview. He's by far not the only person called the last Puritan. Some people call Samuel Adams the last Puritan. Some people, but he's somebody that he's got this puritanic feeling in some of his views, especially about his own life, it seems. But he's also a great critic of Puritanism in The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables. He is somebody that really wants to step away from that perception of sin, even if it seems to, really capture him in a lot of his sort of self-assessment. And he seems to be a figure that's also pretty secular. Some people have even identified him as agnostic in his own religious feelings, because he's somebody that is looking at a very materialist sort of physical world in a lot of his writing as well. And The House of the Seven Gables plays with that kind of interestingly, because all throughout it is the thread of the Pynchon curse. And Hawthorne really plays, he never tells us if the Pynchon curse is real and the owners of the house are dying because of this supernatural affliction, or he also hints, maybe it's a hereditary disease. And there's this modern, rational, scientific explanation for why the Pynchons are dying in similar ways over different generations, is that it's a hereditary disease. And so he really plays with the ambiguity, is it supernatural? Is it rational and scientific? And that's something that I think is a big part of American culture in the time that Hawthorne is living, is his cousin Susanna Ingersoll was a fourth cousin of Robert Ingersoll, who was a famous orator and sort of agnostic that was really disliked by a lot of the religious folks in the 1800s. And so like a distant, like sixth cousin of Hawthorne's was this guy, Robert Ingersoll. I don't know if I haven't really looked into if he ever wrote anything or was even aware of Ingersoll, but it's a period where people are starting to have these conversations. And in terms of the supernatural as well, we know that Sophia was invested in spiritualism because in the era sort of near the end of their lives, in the lead up and especially after the Civil War, which by that point Hawthorne had passed away, the idea that you could communicate with the spirits of the dead became incredibly popular in America and in New England, partly as a reaction to the trauma of the Civil War. But that's something that Sophia felt pretty deeply about. Hawthorne seems to be a little more reserved and is more skeptical about it.
All right, David, is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I always love talking about Hawthorne. And as I was saying, he's somebody that he's still studied in a lot of college courses, high school English classes, but he's definitely slipped a little bit from his place in the canon a century ago. So it's always good to get people thinking and read his books. If you're watching this, pick up a Hawthorne book. I recommend starting with the short stories. There's some great collections out there, like the collected stories of Hawthorne. Those are pretty well curated. Or just pick up Mosses from an Old Nance or the Scarlet Letter and crack it open and find out what people have been talking about for 200 years.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.